All right, these last pages, 41 through 50, are, there's not a lot of math involved. It's actually just a lot of hands-on fun with the calculator and recognizing patterns, okay? So make sure you read through everything, do every step that they have on the page about graphing. You're going to learn about some new methods. One's in having the graph appear as dots. And you've learned about like tracing and things like that already. So you're going to build on what you've done. And we've talked about so far the graph of the sine and the graph of cosine. And now we need to talk about the graph of tangent. But with sine and cosine, we never had something divided by 0. But that's not true with tangent, because when tangent's opposite over adjacent, sometimes the adjacent happens to be 0. And remember, division by 0 is impossible. And so if you get close to where the value for the adjacent side is 0, some interesting things happen on the graph, all right? And so we end up with a y value that ends up out here being very large negative, or here very large positive, and it approaches a number here. But right at that number where the adjacent would be 0, we actually find that the graph never touches, and it never touches, okay? This dotted line, as it's represented in the PACE and on your graphing calculator, is called an asymptote. And the values, as you get closer and closer and closer to that asymptote on this way, get much larger in a positive direction, approaching infinity. And out here, as you're approaching this asymptote, these values for the y get greater and greater in the negative direction, approaching infinity in the negative direction, but they never actually touch that line. So that's what an asymptote means, is it's a line that never gets crossed, it gets approached, but never touched. And then this pattern repeats, and so you'll see in the PACE that there's a certain distance between these lines. I'm not going to try to teach you the whole thing. Easy enough to read it and observe it on your calculator. Now remember, secant is the reciprocal of the cosine of x. And what happens there is the graph looks like this. So it's approaching an asymptote here, and then all of a sudden it appears way up here, comes down, approaches its lowest point here, curves back up, approaches an asymptote. But the problem is sometimes that can be 0 on the bottom. And so that's where these asymptotes appear, okay? So again, it's not as complicated as it looks. You're just looking for patterns. You want to be able to, on a matching section on the test, be able to match something like this to secant, a graph like this to tangent. You're going to have cosecant and cotangent. You're going to see the difference between them. There's some other fine-tuning details that you're going to tune into while you're studying that section, but it's not as hard as it looks. I've said that 3 times now. You prove it by reading through that section, and I trust you'll do well on the end of 1135, and we'll see you when you pass this PACE and move on to 1136.